Welcome to School and Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds featuring prominent leaders, subject matter experts, and thought innovators with their perspectives on the current challenges facing K-12 education. I'm your host, Larissa and Dr, a former teacher, instructional coach, and a member of the Branching Minds team. My hope is to shine a light on phenomenal educators and those that are on a mission to transform our schools and the lives of students. For those of us in education, acronyms like MTSS, PBIS, RTI are part of our everyday language. However, explaining their meaning to our teams or even school communities isn't always straightforward. And that's why on today's podcast episode, we're diving into these terms to bring some clarity and address some common misconceptions. And joining us today is Brian Gaunt, our resident expert and VP of Learning Engineering. And he has 21 years of experience as a school psychologist, RTI coach, even a national and international consultant for MTSS. Brian brings a wealth of knowledge to the conversation. So welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Thank you so much. Good to be here.
I'm excited to have you on the podcast eventually. I was like, as soon as you led some different conversations and webinars, I was like, oh, I got to have Brian on the podcast. He seems like a wealth of knowledge for our listeners. So glad to have you here.
Well, it's good to be here, and hopefully I've got some answers for you.
Well, we're going to start out pretty basic. I would love for you to give our audience a simple and basic definition of what is MTSS and maybe just a few common misconceptions about it.
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it? I do think there's a tendency sometimes for us, all of us, to make this more complicated than it needs to be. I'll start out, short and sweet. I guess, sometimes it really does matter in the details and the nuances depending on your audience. But generally speaking, I think we can just keep it simple to understand that MTSS, first and foremost, is a framework or a blueprint, if you will. One of the misconceptions I often see is that folks will refer to it as a process or a program. And if defined in that manner, that can greatly limit the degree to which you can get power or opportunity out of MTSS. So when I think of MTSS as a framework, it's just basically creating the conditions. It's a blueprint for creating the conditions on our campuses to implement a wide variety of evidence-based practices that together create opportunities for effective decision-making so that every kid gets what they need to be successful, right? It's also in the way that we communicate the components. So I do think most people tend to recognize the tiers, the triangle. I think there's sometimes this perspective that, if I don't mention the triangle, I haven't met my contractual obligation about MTSS involvement. But the tiers is certainly important. What do we have to offer our students, both from the prevention standpoint or instruction at tier 1 standpoint, but also in terms of supports when they need it. And it's good to know what you have to offer and that you have something available for just about any kind of problem that shows up. But how do you know what to give, when to give, for how long, and how do you know if it's working? Those are the questions that really is where our decisions are taking place. And so I think one of the misunderstandings about MTSS is that it's first and foremost a guide for effective, efficient, data-driven, team-based decision-making, because it's the decisions that land us into the choices that we offer our students in hopes that that's going to improve them. So yeah, as a framework, I would say it's more akin to an analogy like having a car. So imagine a school as a car. And a car, as we all know, is made up of a variety of different systems. You've got electrical systems, you've got fluid, you've got mechanical, you've got all the bells and whistles and comfort that goes with it. So there's really not one thing in the car. There's multiple things that make up this car. And schools have been doing decision-making based off of data long before RTI, PBIS, or MTSS showed up. We've already been in the business of making sure that kids who need help get help. And so MTSS, what it brings to the table then is to say, first and foremost, the goals we have about student improvement and school improvement, teacher retention, those are really the goals. MTSS can be leveraged to help get more efficiency, more effectiveness towards those goals. So that car needs to get from point A to point B in a straight line because that's most efficient. And it needs to go fast enough for me to get to my destination on time. Maybe it's not going fast enough. Maybe it's not quite operating as much as I need it to be. Think of MTSS not as adding a machine part to it as much as taking it into a mechanic and running a full diagnostic. The blueprint says this is the way your car should be configured. Let's take a look at how it is configured now. Okay, I see we've got some gaps. Let's start adjusting the systems. So what I try to help folks to do in understanding MTSS is to just think about a simple logic. The outcomes we want to see in our students equitably across all populations happen when students have access to the appropriate constellation of evidence-based practices instructionally and for well-being to help them to reach those goals. But the precision, the quality, the consistency of those evidence-based practices depends greatly on context, the environment, the culture, the climate of our school, the skills and knowledge of our staff, the procedures, the guidelines, the policies. So the system can either help or detract from those practices being able to get off the ground, let alone be happening with fidelity. So I think that's one of the things is MTSS is more than just interventions. It really is about prevention just so much as it is about interventions.
I love the analogy that you gave about the car, because you're right. It is about kind of going deeper and going, okay, what are the ways that we can make supporting students more efficient, and really trying to make it easier to identify those students that need support. And I love the idea of preventative. It's like taking your car in to get the regular oil change too. I mean, to extend the analogy a little bit, but it is about the prevention. Like, where can we spot the students that are nearing risk, and can we help them not prevent further problems down the road, I think is a really good way to think about it. So what do you say when that idea that educators have that MTSS is just one more thing or one more initiative for school? How do you respond to that?
Well, what I would begin to do is probably ask more questions to help understand more about the position and point of view. And so one of the questions I would probably be asking is whether or not they see MTSS as a program. If viewed as a program, there's the tendency to want to see it as one more thing because we have multiple programs that we're operating on our campuses. And if I see that that's the case, it's important to then help elevate that person's understanding to the idea of what's different between a framework versus a program. So a program, I pull it off the shelf. There's a set of instructions. I follow the instructions and I just deliver that program. But MTSS really isn't a telling you what to do as much as a set of guidelines on how to make what we're trying to do work for you at your local site in your local context. So as one more thing to do, I would say then there is perhaps misunderstandings about MTSS, but also it could be a disconnect between MTSS. The spirit of it is really more akin to school improvement. Because in school improvement, we are trying to support all students. There are many, many metrics that we're trying to juggle as school leaders. And so you want to know that, yes, prevention is happening. Kids are doing well at Tier 1. We're seeing kids improve in our benchmark assessments and our summative assessments. And for kids that are falling behind on those assessments, we're giving them supports. And I want to know that those supports are working. Are we closing the gap, right? That's a conversation that we would want to have as principals. So if we frame, again, going back to that car analogy, if I think of it as you have a car, MTSS is not your car. Like, it's not the goal. Improving your teachers, improving your campuses, improving student outcomes, that's the goal. What we're putting into that is better guidance and understanding about what is truly evidence-based. How do you align these pieces? How do they go together? So again, if I'm hearing the language, it's just one more thing to do. It makes me think that most likely MTSS is delegated to a handful of people in a closet space somewhere in the district and not really built into the DNA of the district.
I really like that phrase, built into the DNA of the district. One of the things that I've come to understand in just all my conversation with different educators and experts is that one of the markers of success or long-term success of MTSS within implementation within a district is whether becomes a part of district policy. Like if it's written into board docs, if there's a handbook within the district, if there's procedures that are built around it, and it's not about one person. It's not built around one person's initiative or one person's leadership, but it's about everything that the district does. Like you said, it's built into that DNA. And so that's a really good marker for leaders to think about, is if we want this to be successful long term, is to really how do we build it to a part of what we do as a district.
I think that tends to get confused also with the value of MTSS, right? There's the innovation itself, call it MTSS, PBIS, a new reading curriculum, whatever it is that you're adopting and bringing in for use across your schools, that's the innovation. How you implement it, though, is a different set of knowledge. And so now we're talking implementation science. And so from there, what we learn is that whatever the innovation is that you want to bring into the district, and you see that it's working and is producing the outcomes or changes you'd like to see, how do you keep that in place and sustaining and maintained over time, even when new generations of leaders and teachers are coming into the district? So that's the idea here is when we start to implement these innovations, we also have to plan for the back end of how do we sustain it past our tenure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a whole other conversation, Brian, which I will definitely have you back on for to talk about, because I think that is the mystery that many teams kind of grapple with on a day-to-day basis. How do we make this continue? So I want to go back to sort of some of these basic idea of like PBS and RTI and MTSS. I would love for you to talk a little bit about some of that differences, because we can conflate them all to be the same thing. It's easy to do that. So how does MTSS differ from RTI, PBS, or just the idea of maybe MTSS as another program?
Yeah. So wow, that's a good question and not necessarily a straightforward one sometimes to answer, to be honest with you, because it depends on where this work was started and where it's taking place. So different states, I've seen states treat MTSS as just a new brand of RTI. I've seen places where MTSS is more of an umbrella term to describe the union of RTI and PBIS working together. I have been more accustomed to the way it's sort of talked about in the literature of more thinking of it in kind of historical evolution, if you will, like sort of RTI itself really was new to a lot of people in mid-2000s, but the concept of making decisions based on how students respond to the services or instruction or intervention we provide is not really that new. It's actually been around since about the 1950s or 60s. So there's pockets of where this practice was already happening in much of the United States, even as special education was just born in the 1970s. So RTI really has been in there, and it had different language. Pre-referral intervention process was one of those terms. It was basically using this problem-solving process. So for me in my training as a former school psychologist is, RTI really is the process of identifying students in need as early as possible, identifying why they're struggling, and providing a support or a solution that's matched to that need, and monitoring the fidelity and progress of that plan over time to then adjust for continuous improvement until the gap is closed. Like that's in a nutshell RTI. MTSS, though, is where we step back and see a larger context in which even if you want to implement RTI as the innovation, as the evidence-based practice, the precision, quality, and consistency of teams being able to engage in that practice depends on the larger context that you're implementing it. So we do need to think about school improvement. We have to think about prevention in Tier 1. And that tiered structure was already coming out of PBIS literature as early as the 2000s. So a lot of this was happening parallel. And I think over time, people have struggled. One of my suspicions is that if we talk about MTSS, PBIS as each having its own sort of satellite national organizations that drive a lot of the thinking and the practices that those describe, that's one conversation of differences, because then you get into branding, you get into labels, you get into implementation monitoring tools. PBI still has their separate tools and MTSS field has their separate tools. From the bottom up, though, if you think about it in terms of we're all trying to get at the same student outcomes, we're trying to approach the whole student learner. What are the practices of a highly effective, engaged classroom environment in which both evidence-based lesson planning and instruction is happening in a context of safe, orderly, predictable, and active engaged environment? So, PBIS contributes to that. Our academic standards and practices of instruction contribute to that. And there's a much more blended whole understanding of how PBIS and MTSS work if you just focus on the practice of classroom instruction. PBIS encourages us to also then think about safety routines and predictability in our non-classroom-based settings, but it also provides us a wonderful blueprint for operationally defining what Tier 1 is for prevention for behavior. You've got to have expectations, you've got to have rules, you've got to be able to teach those, and you need to be providing students with multiple rounds of feedback. I think what gets in the way sometimes of schools trying to understand how it all comes together is we have different vocabulary still, and I see that as a barrier. In PBIS, we're going to talk about giving kids rewards, or we're going to talk about giving them tokens, perhaps. But in academics, we're talking about giving them feedback. It's really all the same. I mean, saying to somebody, saying to a student, I really appreciate the way that you helped so-and-so do this, expectation that shows quality in our school, et cetera, citizenship. Here's a token. That's giving feedback. So we're using different terms to talk about the same thing. And I think if we can find a way to bridge that terminology gap, we'll see a lot more understanding about how PBIS and MTSS really are more similar than different.
Well, I think it's important to sort of, understand the history of that and how it can kind of all blends together. And really what we're talking about with, RTI or even PBIS, they are tiered levels of support when you think about, like when you kind of get down into the understanding of what each of those things are, they all have that multi-tiered level of support. And so I think that that's where it's like kind of understanding how MTSS can help sort of bridge the gap and bring all of those terms and teams together in general.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to talk a little bit about some of those essential components of an MTSS system. Like when we're talking about MTSS, and what are those essential components that every system maybe needs to be effective?
Yeah, great question. This is where, again, we see some variability in the way states are defining or characterizing MTSS. Different models have different components identified, but if you compare them all, there's a lot more similarity than differences. So what I would say to folks is really just generally speaking across any of the different models of MTSS that are floating out there, think of MTSS components as two buckets. The core practices or components of MTSS really are the tiers. What are the options we have to give kids from prevention all the way up to intensive needs? And what is that protocol of evidence-based, data-driven decision-making practice that we follow and use across all of our teams at our school? Those are the core practices. Now we can think about the other components as system variables or systems components. These are things that already are included in the school. You have leadership, you have professional development and coaching supports, you have schedules, you have resource inventories that basically support communicating what we have to offer kids when we find need. We have data systems, data platforms, we have assessment tools, we have data sources. And so those are, think of it as infrastructures. So when we have, again, those core practices of here's this continuum of instruction, intervention, well-being supports and services that are available for students based on need. And here's how we ascribe need and follow through with decisions around helping kids, this problem-solving process. Now, then it's how can we make sure we've got people who can do that, who have the time to do that, and have the resources to follow through with the decisions they make out of that teamwork. And that's where those other system components come in. But again, I would ascribe or encourage everyone to check with your state first, wherever you're located, because again, different states might have a little bit more prescriptiveness about how they communicate their components. And then think about then what is the tool that I want to be using at my school to sort of spot check where am I at implementing those components. Now, if you don't have one ascribed to you by or prescribed to you by your state, or you've not yet adopted one, at Branch and Minds, we do have a tool that we call the Self-Assessment of MTSS Implementation, or the SAMI, which we've built based on basically a collection of different versions that are out there and try to find something that was more universal. But whatever that tool is that you're using, that's the idea, is once a year, let's check to see where we're at with these different components. And if some of them are lower than others, let's pinpoint those for possibly improvement into the next school year's plan.
Yeah. I think you identified in there just, with the self-assessment is really to think about what are the things we're already doing? Because I know that that's one of the struggles that many districts have when they begin to implement. And, the teachers are like, this is one more, you're asking us to do one more thing. And really it is about examining, like there's so many aspects of MTSS the school's already doing, but it's about having this sort of blueprint over everything and going, okay, how well are we doing these things? And are those things working together or against each other? Or are they repetitive? Like, are there some initiatives that are repetitive that maybe we can kind of figure out a way to streamline and make more efficient? And so I think that's an important step in the process of implementation, is really assessing how well are we doing these things that are under this blueprint. Okay, so you kind of brought this up a little bit earlier when we were talking about PBIS, but what would you say to someone who asks, like, how do academics, behavior, and SEL all kind of work together in that MTSS framework? And why is it more than just about interventions? Because I think there's times when we say MTSS and people have an understanding that this is just about students who need intervention. What would you say to that?
Well, what I would say is, do you have infinite resources or do you have finite resources? And I know that every school I've ever worked with has said they have finite resources. Given that, how many kids do you have that are in need for one thing or another? Just collectively, any need goes on the list. And if that percentage of students reaches a certain point, you are overwhelming your resources that you have available to you to help those kids. And let's face it, giving kids interventions that are going to work is very resource heavy. There are a lot of schools out there that are giving interventions to very large percentages of students. We're saying more than 20% of students, 30, 40% of their kids are trying to put into interventions. And you can provide access to 40% of your population. It doesn't mean they're going to get a high quality intervention experience, though. When we have finite resources and too much need, we dilute our services, and then kids don't benefit. So that's sort of the why it can't be about just interventions. It can't just be about cleaning up the spill from the leak. It's about stopping the leak. And so we do have to have kind of both sides of that candle burning, if you will. The thing that's interesting to me is that, yes, as we go back to the core practices of database decision making, and we need to decide what we're going to do for students who have a need, is the way in which sometimes we're making those decisions in silos. That somehow I've got a reading team that only talks about reading data. I've got a behavior team that only talks about behavior, and I've got, attendance team. And yet Brian might show up on all three lists. And nobody's really talking about Brian's experience in terms of having to participate in multiple interventions that chances are should really be cooperating or coordinating. So the way in which we identify kids, it might be a very specific indicator or singular performance issue, but it could be a student who has multiple performance needs. And what I would encourage schools to do is to say, of the kids who have multiple needs evidenced in your data, just consider whether or not there is a clear priority to intervene now and hold on the others. The idea being that, is there one of these that if we improve that, it'll have a ripple effect on these others naturally? The other approach is to say, of those issues or needs that these students have, what's the picture there? What's the story? Is one kind of contributing to the other? It's kind of a thing. And so that's, in a general sense, I would say, or simple, is academic behavior cases. And as a school psychologist in the past, I've never worked on a student referral that was about academics that didn't have some behavioral or social emotional component to the plan. And I've never worked on a behavior case that didn't have some implications for preventative instruction and pre-correction kinds of activities, but also then the way in which we provide feedback on the back end. So yeah, I think we want to help to understand that these sources of performance that we're monitoring on students aren't really separate performances by the student. At every moment in the day, the whole child is the whole child. So even when they're taking an academic test, behaviors at the table, SEL's at the table, and of course attendance got to be there to take the test.
Yeah. And I think that what it makes me think about is it really isn't about addressing the symptoms, because I think if you're doing this in silos, you're addressing symptoms and not actually getting to the root of the problem. And you have to look at a lot of components, about the, every aspect to really truly understand the root of the issue. Because I would think about it. I think about this, like if I go to the doctor and he just addresses the symptoms, then it doesn't actually tell me like why I'm feeling this certain way, right? It doesn't actually say, here's the root, let's address the root. And so you really have to, in the same way, for addressing the whole child. I also love that you talked about how when you bring all those teams together, it really helps tell the story about that student. And I think, because sometimes the argument about database decision making, there is this sort of sentiment, and I know this as a classroom teacher, is that my students were more than numbers, right? Their test score did not tell and identify who they are as a person and the other struggles that they have. And so I think it helps bring back to that idea that the student is a whole person and we need to address them as such. And I think that the idea of MTSS is that we're wrapping around the student in every way of making sure that we address all aspects of their story. So
the shortcut or the hack, if you will, that I give to teachers, especially knowing that, teachers aren't generally taught a lot of these kinds of analytical data analysis types of literacy skills. And yet we're bombarding them with data all the time and asking them to make sense of that and make decisions. And so one of the things that I do to keep it simple is to say, treat academic performance results, whether that's academic tests, whether it's formative assessments, but treat academic performance towards standards and grade level expectations as your North Star. And when students are struggling in any of those academic areas, consider all the other sources of student performance as possible reasons why that's happening. Students not doing well academically because they're not coming to school. There's an attendance problem. So, okay, well, if we fix the attendance problem, we'll have seat and chair, and then we'll be able to give instruction. They'll get their dosage of instruction that they're missing. The student is not doing well academically because they're disengaging, which shows up as misbehavior in the classroom. All right, well, if we correct that, then we should see better performance. So the idea here is that whatever you define as the priority problem to solve, a behavior problem, academic problem, consider all the other sources of performance as contributors in your analysis of why.
Yeah. I think that's really great. Well, Brian, you answered so many really great questions, and I'm so excited to share this with our audience and maybe have you back on. We'll talk more about implementation and all of that kind of stuff, but I appreciate your expertise and I'm excited to share that. We'll share resources that Brian mentioned in the show notes and look forward to chatting more about MTSS.
Great. Thanks, Larissa, and thank you, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Schoolin' Around, a podcast hosted by Branching Minds. Go ahead and subscribe to our feed wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget, if you are enjoying our content, would you do us a favor and rate and review our podcast on iTunes? This helps others find our podcast and lets us know how much you love what we're creating. Branching Minds is an educational technology company using learning sciences and technology to help districts effectively personalize learning through MTSS. To learn more about us, check out our website, branchingminds.com, or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn at Branching Minds.